they have both the state and federal government have had a mitigation effort underway for many years, going back to the Kyoto Treaty, and then in California, AB 32. All the work has been on mitigating climate change. But we realized several years ago we were not going to be able to mitigate climate change in a way that kept us from having impacts around the world. And California in particular, we were well aware that we were having flood, fire, and all the other things going on. So the ARCCA collaboratives have been very important in that effort. Next slide, please. You can see here some of the things that we have done. We have actually been identified as a resource for the state in the executive order and in the climate change plans at the state. But what that means is that we really have been engaged with them. When the state does documents, they expect us to do a very thorough review of those, and we have, for example, on our third set of documents this month on different plans that the state has put forth. And we are putting together some very robust comments on those. And then we get for example, in the state research plan, you will see ARCCA's footprint in that and a lot of the research that's related to regions. You can see here some of the other efforts and things that we have done. Also, on the conferences like the New Partners and the national conferences, we have been very important in putting those together. Next slide, please. As I said, we're also, my region here is the Capital Region Climate Readiness Collaborative. It covers these counties. You can see here the goals that we have. Again, amplify the voice of our region and state and national planning. I would note, as you saw, there's 5 collaboratives around the state. Each of those is, California's a big state. So what's important in Sacramento might be less important in LA. The coastal collaboratives are all interested more in coastal resilience and sea level rise than we are, but we and Sierra Camp, for example, are interested in fires and in the urban-rural interface and the forest and forest health. So each of us brings a different set of skills and interests to this collaborative, and it makes the whole is bigger than any of the parts. Next slide, please. This shows our members. You can see that we're really quite diverse. Government agencies, nonprofits, some private organizations. We also have the Chamber of Commerce in Sacramento. Sac Metro Chamber of Commerce is working right now to join us. We have our Council of Governments. The University of Davis, UC Davis, has had a significant impact on what we've done. And we have, all of us worked very closely both at the CRC level and at the ARCCA level with the Office of Planning and Research at the state. Next slide. And this shows some of the products that we have been able to do here in our region. A project on small business risk management, a project on barriers to local water agencies for incorporating long-term climate planning, work in helping Yolo County do their climate plan, and then working on the regional transportation document. We also work closely with the Civic Spark program, which is an AmeriCorps program for college graduates. We have right now 2 directly working and 4 sitting here at our district, but working on projects that are relevant to climate adaptation in the Sacramento region. And is that the last slide?
It sure is.
Okay, well, that gives you an overview of ARCCA and also our collaborative, and I'll turn it back over to the moderator.
Great. Thank you so much, Larry. And next, we want to dive into the featured topic of today's webinar, starting with Meg Arnold presenting on the Capital Region Business Resiliency Initiative. Meg's 20-plus-year career includes roles in the private, nonprofit, and academic worlds. As CEO of Startup for 5 years, she led the nonprofit's efforts to accelerate technology ventures to the benefit of the Sacramento area's economy. Earlier at UC Davis, Meg supported technology commercialization and entrepreneurship on the campus, developing programs to support campus-originated startup companies and participating in technology transfer licensing to new startups. Currently, as an independent consultant, Meg supports clients in areas including business development and project leadership services. Her education includes an MBA from the University of San Francisco and a BA from Cornell University. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Meg.
Happy to be here, and I just want to check that you can both hear me and see my screen.
Yep, loud and clear, and I can see your screen.
Wonderful. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of the webinar on behalf of the Capital Region Business Resiliency Initiative, or BRI, as we call it. I will probably reflexively refer to it as BRI while I'm talking, and so that's what it means, Business Resiliency Initiative. I'm going to first show you a few photos of some of the utter disaster that we saw hit far too close to home this late summer. Our Business Resiliency Initiative began about a year ago and arose out of the recognition of the vulnerabilities that our region faces and the fact that climate change is bringing increased uncertainty about those vulnerabilities to our region as it is to the rest of the globe. Here in the capital region, we suffer risk of fire, which of course was all too obvious this past summer, from drought, also all too obvious these past few years, flood, which some of the burned areas of our region are now even more vulnerable to as the rains approach later this afternoon and hopefully later this winter as well as extreme heat as climate change continues apace, and even earthquake, although we are a fairly seismically stable part of the state. So the issue of business resiliency and the project that we've been involved with is rooted in climate change, naturally, and the increased unpredictability of the disasters that we are at risk of. But at the same time, it's also reflective of just frankly a fundamental set of business risks that can and should be addressed through basic business planning processes, but that so often actually are not done at the small business level for a host of reasons, including small businesses' lack of resource, perceived lacks of resource, of time, and of necessary expertise. So what we're trying to do with the Business Resiliency Initiative is increase the awareness of the importance of doing this resiliency work, and provide businesses with the tools that to help them more easily act on their own behalf and put resiliency plans in place, and then also to engage not just within the four walls of their individual businesses, but also, because of all of the interdependencies with public infrastructure, also to motivate them to engage with and be engaged by their local and regional government entities who are obviously doing their own disaster preparedness and hazard assessment and hazard mitigation work on an ongoing basis. So when we talk about business resiliency, I want to make it clear that from our perspective, we're absolutely focused on the small business sector for reasons that we'll get into in a minute or two. And that what we mean is driving businesses to build capacity before a time of crisis, so that when a crisis does hit, they are better able to withstand the effects and the impacts. And so resiliency, the way we frame it, is about protecting three major asset groups: a company's people, a company's facilities, physical infrastructure, and a company's information. And there are obviously different strategies for doing all of those things, and our goal is not to provide a single answer and say this is the right way to do it, but provide businesses with the ability to make those determinations for themselves. And the other important point that I mentioned a little bit a minute ago is that there are a whole host of things that businesses can more or less control that have to do with their own four walls and the business and the way they conduct their business. but you've got employees getting to and from work on roads and on bridges and on public transportation. You've got business operations dependent on power and on water and on sewer and a whole host of other interdependencies with the public sector. And so we also couch resiliency as highlighting the importance of businesses interacting with their local government agencies who are tasked with ensuring community resiliency. And at the very least, we want to see businesses informing themselves of the plans that the public sector has in place, and even ideally even better, engaging with and helping to inform public sector efforts about what's important to them as businesses, as key components of the economy. I pulled this graph here from the report that Katie will be speaking to in a minute. It shows an increase in global weather-related loss events over the last, I can't even do that math, I can't even do that math. That's embarrassing, 34 years. And you can see it is trending higher over recent, and if you actually extend this graph even further back into the past, the recent increase in weather-related disasters is even more apparent. Our world is clearly changing, and the effects of those changes will drive all of us in different ways, including changing the environment in which businesses all operate and the risks that they need to be aware of and more conscious of actually assessing. You know, businesses are absolutely aware of and even increasingly incorporating this type of planning into their operations. Not surprisingly, including resiliency or disaster preparedness that's based on climate change is most often done by the largest companies, which have the greatest set of resources and the ability to tap some expertise. That's the set of entities that the C2ES Weathering the Next Storm report focused on, as Katie will discuss. As you can see from the slide here, the Risky Business Report assessed climate risk specific to California and asked businesses what specific climate impacts they expect for their California operations. And the ones you can see here are presumably not an enormous surprise. Increases in extreme heat conditions, changes in precipitation, increases in some places, decreases in others, changing from rain to snow. Rather the opposite, changing from snow to rain, shifting agricultural patterns and crop yields, increased electricity demand and resultant higher costs, heat-related decline in labor productivity. That's referring specifically to outdoor laborers, for example, in the agricultural industry, where increased heat will bring increased physical difficulty in working outdoors for prolonged periods of time. So businesses are absolutely recognizing, anticipating, and beginning to plan for some of these impacts. But again, at the small business level, it can be really problematic to do that just based on time and resource availability. Any kind of preparedness is better than none in the small business sector. Disaster impacts on business can be obvious and immediate, but they can also be drawn out longer term and sometimes a little bit surprising. Obviously, in the near term, if you're forced to close, loss of customers, business disruption, uninsured losses if you're not aware of what your insurance policies cover. Outside of one's own control, there can be supply chain or distribution impacts. Your own business itself may be unaffected, but you may not be able to get materials from key suppliers. You may not be able to get finished product out to customers, depending on the type of disaster that's been felt and where your supply and distribution chains lie. And then in the small business sector in particular, cash flow and cash balance vulnerabilities are very real. Many small businesses operate on a really narrow cash buffer and are frankly unable financially to withstand an unexpected period of being closed and still be able to maintain payroll and other financial obligations. So thinking about those matters ahead of time and having For example, a revolving credit line available ahead of time. You always want to borrow when you don't need to borrow, because when you need to borrow, it'll be really hard to do. So thinking through those types of issues ahead of time is really important to help sustain small businesses, because they are critical to our economy. Now, the data here shows information about small business in California's capital region, but across the nation, small business forms the vast majority of economic activity in our nation. Here in our region, businesses with fewer than 20 employees account for 90% of the region's total business entities, or did in 2012. And businesses with 250 or fewer employees account for almost 80% of total private sector jobs. So widespread disaster that affects small businesses as well as large ones, and affects small businesses that may not be prepared, can have substantial and long-lasting negative economic impact on our region as on any region, which is why the focus on resiliency is particularly essential. There's a little bit of a catch-22 here for small business on the resiliency topic, because businesses without resiliency plans in place are the least likely to reopen or recover after a disaster. That's perhaps not surprising. Small businesses are the least likely group of businesses to have a resiliency plan in place. And frankly, most small businesses are also among the least prepared to rebound after a disruption, and they can often be most vulnerable to impacts of weather, oftentimes for the simple reason that they're likely to have only one operating working location, for example. And 40 to 60% of small businesses, if they're forced to close on an unexpected basis for 5 or more days, never reopen after a major disaster. And that's a huge economic hit in aggregate. So without going, I'm conscious of time, and I'm afraid I've already taken too much. What we did was we put together a business resiliency toolkit, which is online at resilientbusiness.org. It takes a whole host of best practices. It lays them out hopefully in really clean, clear, plain English, and steps folks through how they can put together their own business resiliency plan on their own behalf. Sorry, I just wanted to see what that slide was. We are going to be going out on a county-by-county basis in the Sacramento region and conducting hands-on workshops directly with small businesses, working with a host of the partners that you see on this slide, particularly some of the local business organizations, including chambers of commerce, and hosting those workshops as a way to get this information much more directly out into the hands of small businesses and motivate them to action. And I think I will stop there. We've got some contact info. Myself and my colleague Tammy Cronin are leading this on behalf of Valley Vision, and I'll turn it back to you, Julia.
Great, thanks so much, Meg. And I'm realizing that the slides are moving a little slower than expected, and I apologize that there are always some kind of technical complications with webinars, but rest assured all of these presentations will be made available online, so everyone will get a copy of them. Great. And next up, we have Katie Mayer, who will be talking about the new Weathering the Next Storm report. 1 second. And Katie is a science fellow and resilience coordinator at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. She contributes to C2ES's efforts to assess and communicate the current state of knowledge regarding climate change and its impacts, and to promote actions that strengthen climate resilience. Ms. Mayer has more than 8 years of experience supporting climate change impacts and adaptation projects. Prior to joining C2ES, she worked for ICF International, assisting a range of clients, including the US EPA, the Federal Highway Administration, the US Agency for International Development, and state and local governments, in assessing climate change risks and developing adaptation solutions. Ms. Mayer holds a Master of Environmental Science and Management from the Bren School at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the College of Worcester. Thanks so much for being with us today, Katie.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. We're having some internet issues here, so I think you're going to be running my slides, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So just wanted to, before I get started, just give everyone on the call a little background on C2ES. As Julia mentioned, we're the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. We're a small nonprofit that's located in Arlington, Virginia, and we work with businesses and cities and states to advance climate and energy issues. So we've started to do a lot of work on resilience in the past 8 years and have done a number of different reports. And so one of the latest reports we looked at was what are businesses doing on resilience and how are they addressing climate risks. So if you go to the next slide. I think Meg talked kind of to this already, but obviously weather and climate impacts are costly to businesses. Businesses have disruptions to production, operational delays. They have concerns that are related to climate and weather changes. So obviously they are thinking about these impacts. And obviously in California, there's been drought in the past year, but also in different parts of the country, there have been other severe weather events that impact businesses. So, you know, oftentimes we may think of climate change as impacting coastal areas or areas prone to drought, but there are also areas like the Midwest that deal with extreme winter storm events or drought or flooding. So businesses in those areas are concerned about those impacts as well. So if you go to the next slide. So based on these concerns, we talked to a number of different businesses and produced the report that we're talking about today, which came out in September, called Weathering the Next Storm. And if you go on to the next slide, this report was a follow-on to a report that we did in 2013, where we looked at the public disclosures of the S&P Global 100 companies, so large global companies, and what they're saying about what they're doing on climate change risks. So I think Meg gave a good introduction to what businesses are doing at the small business level, and our report kind of focused at the more large business level. So our previous report looked at their public disclosures, but we wanted to get a little bit more information about what companies really are doing internally, the challenges that they're facing, and what they're trying to do in the future. And so we wanted to do interviews and talk to companies directly to find out a little bit more information. So for this report that we just released, again, we looked at the public disclosures from the S&P Global 100 companies. We also did interviews and had a number of different workshops where we talked directly with companies. And we also involved talking to cities and states as well. So if you go on to the next slide. So based on our findings, out of the S&P Global 100 companies, we found that 90% of them are seeing extreme weather and climate as risks to their business. So they are seeing it as important, and they are disclosing information that is related to their individual climate risks. So if you go on to the next slide, this kind of breaks out where the companies are disclosing this information publicly in the various different reports that we looked at. So the CDP reports, which some people may be familiar with, they used to be called the Carbon Disclosure Project and now just go by CDP. It's a voluntary reporting program where companies can report on greenhouse gas emissions, energy usage, water usage, and there's a specific number of questions that get to resilience actions and what companies are undertaking. And so it makes sense that companies are identifying what they're undertaking in that report specifically. And then to a lesser extent, we found that companies are reporting their activities in sustainability reports and annual reports, and to the least extent in SEC filings. And so that's a kind of an important issue that we found was businesses find it hard to determine whether climate change is material to their risk, to their business, especially because when you're looking at large global companies, many of these companies have facilities around the world, and so they could be geographically diversified or have products that are made in multiple locations. So if an extreme event destroys a particular factory, they probably have backup somewhere else. So a lot of companies are struggling with this idea of, is climate material to the business itself? So if you go on to the next slide. In particular, the issues that companies are concerned about, of course, extreme weather events are important. We heard a lot about Hurricane Sandy and events in Thailand flooding. But we also heard that companies are concerned about long-term changes. So they are looking at changes in temperature and sea level rise over time. And one of the most frequently mentioned risks was from precipitation extremes and drought. So companies are often concerned about future water risk because water is a really important part to many manufacturing and other business activities. Most of the companies see the risks as near term, so within the next 10 years and also beyond, but they see it as something they need to address in the near term, which is important. And of course, the thing that they're most concerned about is their disruptions to production and operational costs. So if you go on to the next slide, this just kind of looks at how companies are addressing climate risk. So the majority of companies we talk to are relying on routine business continuity or risk management planning. So they're using their existing planning methods to kind of integrate climate change in. But we found that a larger number of companies are starting to undertake climate change vulnerability assessments. So they're incorporating assessments of climate risk specifically, or risk from climate to water, which is an important step for a lot of large businesses to take. And to a lesser extent, companies are also looking at climate models, doing research, upgrading their infrastructure, equipment, and also engaging with suppliers, customers, governments, and other entities. Go on to the next slide. So because we found that most businesses are using their existing risk management planning, we found that basically businesses are looking at climate as a lens to look at their existing risks. So they're looking at how the existing business activities are affected by climate change. So it's not necessarily a risk unto itself. It's a risk laid on top of what they're already considering. So this kind of puts the climate change into a familiar business context, making it easier for businesses to take on those kinds of assessments. But there are some drawbacks to this approach. There could be some aspects of climate change that aren't considered in a business continuity planning conventionally. So things like indirect impacts or cumulative impacts may be missed in this kind of approach. If you go into the next slide, we also wanted to find out the different departments within a company that are undertaking these kinds of activities, and it really seemed to be pretty non-standardized. It was very different from company to company. Sometimes it was within the risk management department, or it was in the sustainability department, sometimes in engineering or facility management, and sometimes in emergency management. So it seems like every company organizes the activity based on what makes most sense to their business, which can cause some problems. It can mean that various departments within a company aren't necessarily coordinating on their approaches to climate change. So they may be using different climate scenarios or have different assumptions for future planning. So we found that it is really important for companies to kind of internally coordinate and discuss these activities and the concerns for their business. So if you go on to the next slide, in general, we found that businesses take two different approaches to assessing climate risks. And none of these is the perfect approach or the right approach, but we found that they kind of fell into these two different categories. Some companies look at risks from the top down. So they look across their entire business and their operations and look at broadly how climate change will affect all of those different parts of the business. Versus the second approach, which is more bottom up, where a company may decide to assess risk for a specific region or a specific facility that may have experienced risks in the past, or they may already know that it's vulnerable, or they may focus on a specific threat, so drought or flooding. And often this approach is taken by companies because it is really hard to undertake a large assessment of a worldly business that has operations in many different places. So some companies take this approach of selecting a specific topic or area to focus on. go on to the next slide. And I'm sorry if I'm going too fast. This I can't see the internet, so the slides aren't showing up for me. So I'm just going by my own slides. So you can tell me if I need to slow down. So just an example of the top-down approach. Diageo is a global liquor and beverage company that operates all around the world, and since they rely on agricultural commodities, they are very concerned about what will happen to future water supplies. So they do annual company-wide evaluations of risk to their water supplies and their key agricultural sourcing areas. And they also developed an integrated water strategy to look at how they could reduce their water usage and also replenish the water supplies that they take out. In addition, they also evaluate the agricultural risk. So they did a vulnerability assessment for 6 of their critical commodities that they rely on: cream, sorghum, barley, grapes, agave, and sugar. And so they looked at kind of how these different products are going to change under various different climate scenarios. In particular, just an example, they do a lot of growing of barley in Kenya, and barley has to grow at a certain altitude, and with climate change, that altitude is going to get higher and higher, and so there's going to be less land available for the barley to be grown. So they have done assessments of what land is going to be available and where they may need to produce a different crop or additional areas where they may need to plant barley. So if you go on to the next slide, an example of bottom-up approach is from Exelon, which is a utility company, and they wanted to understand what the water risks would be to their utility, and they decided to focus on one particular area, one watershed that they knew was going to be vulnerable to water risks. So they used a particular tool that was developed by WRI, the World Resources Institute, called Aqueduct, which a lot of businesses use to identify the specific areas that would be vulnerable to water risks. So they developed a detailed watershed model for this particular area and looked specifically how climate change would impact water availability in that area to the facilities in that area. And they also started to implement new resilience actions. So because the water supplies might be limited in that area, they started to replace the water-cooled equipment with more air-cooled equipment. So they wouldn't necessarily need to rely on water supplies if they had drought conditions in the future. So those are just kind of 2 examples of how 2 large businesses have taken on climate impacts and taking on resilience actions in response to the risks that they have looked at. So if you go on to the next slide, we found from a lot of businesses that there's some similar challenges that they're facing. One thing that we hear a lot from businesses of all different sizes is that more locally specific climate data is necessary. People want to know where specifically in a certain region, a specific facility, how climate change is going to impact that specific area. So it's clear that we need some more localized, downscaled climate projections. And businesses also want guidance on how to translate that data into specific risk scenarios. So, there are a number of different scenarios that are out there, but they aren't specific to business operations. So businesses would like some guidance on how to do that. Another challenge is fitting climate impacts into the business planning timeframe. So a lot of climate change impacts we see over a longer time period, but businesses may need to make decisions that look a day out, a month out, a year out, and may not be able to consider what the potential climate change impacts are in that time frame because they may be minimal. So kind of businesses need some sort of approach to incorporating the changes that are going to occur in a shorter time period into their planning. And finally, most relevant to this webinar, a lot of businesses find that they have a lot of challenges with outside the fence risks. So no matter how much they may improve their resilience of their facilities and their operations, outside of their fence, the resilience of the community surrounding them will impact the business. So if a road is destroyed or a bridge is destroyed during a storm, employees can't get to work, the customers can't get to their products. So it's obviously in the business's interest to work together with the communities that they're in to address resilience and climate risks. So in that vein, we wanted to consider who businesses should be working with and who they are working with. So if you go on to the next slide, we found that right now businesses are mostly partnering with academics to understand climate impacts and the particular risks they may face. They're also working with NGOs, government agencies and consultants and other companies and trade groups. But we found that a lot of businesses aren't working specifically with local areas, city and state governments. This isn't an area that businesses have gotten into mostly, specifically for climate change planning. So if you go on to the next slide, we found that this was a major recommendation for our report was that it's very important for businesses and local areas to work together on resilience. So enhancing public-private partnerships for resilience is a really important activity. And as I mentioned, businesses face risks beyond their fence line, and partnerships in local resilience are common, but the inclusion of businesses is often rare. So if you go on to the next slide, very appropriate to this webinar, we found that intermediate institutions can play an important role in bringing business voices to urban resilience planning. So climate collaboratives like the ones that exist in California are really great at bringing businesses together, and organizations like Valley Vision are really great for that too. And we've seen similar things in Boston and Washington State, Detroit, and other places. So if you go on to the next slide, just quickly I'll mention that funding for resilience is a challenge, and I know it's a challenge at the local level. It's also a challenge for businesses. So I think that's an area that we're going to be hearing a lot more about and focusing on is financing resilience. So I'll just quickly move to the last slide and mention that these are takeaways. We really want to be focused on how to bring businesses, cities, and states together on working on resilience planning. So this report was kind of the intro to our next phase of work in working together with those various different stakeholders and approaching resilience at the local level. So I'll leave it there and turn it over back to Julia.
Great. Thanks so much, Katie. And again, these slides will be made available after this webinar. And next up, we have Chris Benjamin from PG&E, a Pacific Gas and Electric Company. Chris Benjamin is the Director of Corporate Sustainability and leads a team that works collaboratively to measure, communicate, and improve PG&E sustainability performance, covering economic, environmental, and social areas. This includes leading PG&E's annual Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability Report, Carbon Disclosure Project, and Dow Jones Sustainability Index submissions, enterprise-wide sustainability metrics, and a variety of related strategic engagement, policy, and benchmarking initiatives for the company. Prior to joining PG&E, Chris was a Vice President at Eastern Research Group and a Policy Associate for the National Recycling Coalition. He received a Master's in Environmental Management from Duke University and a BA from Boston College. Thanks so much for being with us today, Chris.
Well, thanks so much, Julia. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Okay, well, this has just been a great webinar so far. I am just aware of the time, and I know I've got a few slides to get through. I'll try to get through them quickly so that we have time at the end for questions, because I know there are a number of folks on the webinar. Just to maybe start, many of you may be familiar with PG&E. We provide gas and electricity to about 16 million people in Northern and Central California. And I just want to applaud the work of ARCCA and the collaborative that Larry and Meg have described. and the approach you're taking, and also I think the tremendous leadership on this topic at the local level, particularly here in California, and also the great work that C2ES has been doing, exploring the business perspective on this important issue. If I can advance my slides here. There we go. I think, you know, from PG&E's perspective, when it comes to climate change, you know, we, like many others, have been focused a long time on reducing our carbon footprint, helping our customers do the same. We're pleased to be sending a delegation from PG&E to Paris for the climate talks that are going on to help the California story, you know, that we can reduce emissions while growing the economy at the same time. But like many utilities and others on this call, we are increasingly focused on adapting to a changing climate. What you can see on this slide is the four key aspects to how we are approaching this challenge. I think it reinforces many of the points that both Meg and Katie have made. We are using our emergency response plans and procedures as a vehicle to address more near-term risks. Meg talked about the Valley Fire, for example. Active engagement at the federal, state, and local level. There's a tremendous amount happening at all three of those levels. We have a risk assessment underway within PG&E, which I'll speak about in a minute. And then something that may be a little bit unique is that we actually have a team of scientists who have been studying the various you know, potential scenarios and impacts from climate change for some time, and we really use that to help inform the work that we do. With regard to our risk assessment, we have undertaken a multi-year holistic risk assessment looking at the risks to PG&E's infrastructure from different natural hazards, covering all of our assets, gas and electric. And we've basically been following a structured process, assessing a variety of different scenarios. And what we are learning will be incorporated into our annual strategic planning process, and it also is directly informing our emergency preparedness and response planning and activities. So one of the things that we think is important is to take a structured process and also just settle on a series of different scenarios. And I'll just walk through a few of these. One of them is the risk of flooding, which I think has already been discussed on this call. Like many others, we are looking at, you know, the 100 and 500 year flood maps, and essentially, you know, overlaying those against our infrastructure to see where the greatest, you know, risk lies. I think one thing that's important to note is that we actually, you know, while it may be a 100-year storm, you know, we anticipate that in the future, you know, that could become a 1 in 10-year flood event in certain areas, such as the Central Valley. We also are participating in various studies. The Bay Area Council Economic Institute produced this report earlier this year that we participated in, that actually assessed the potential impacts of a superstorm on the Bay Area, and found that it could potentially have a $10.4 billion impact on the Bay Area economy. The impact to PG&E and our substations was fairly modest relative to that, but you know, this is the kind of thing that it's important for businesses to do, is to participate and learn and see where the potential risks may be. Another scenario that we've looked at is a sea level rise. Using the latest science, what we've done is focused on the year 2050, and you can see from this slide there's a range there, 24 inches of sea level rise on the high end, and that's essentially the scenario that we have used is 2 feet of sea level rise, and overlaid that with our infrastructure again to see where the potential risk may be. A number of local governments, probably many of the folks on this call, are also looking at this, and it's something that definitely we're pleased to participate in, and has been really helping to inform our efforts. Others have mentioned changing precipitation patterns. Here in California, we continue to experience severe drought conditions. We've been doing a number of different things to help address the drought, reduce the impacts not only on our operations, but also to try to help our customers. Energy efficiency has been one particular tool that we have used. We also operate the largest privately owned hydroelectric system, and so less precipitation, changing precipitation patterns definitely result in a risk because there's less hydro available. In a typical year, about 15% or so of the electricity we deliver to our customers comes from hydropower. In 2014, for example, I think it was down to 8%. We're also very active looking long-term. I think the focus here in terms of assessing the potential impacts to our hydro system has really been focused on collaborative research with state agencies, universities to better understand the potential trends and forecasts for this, so that we can better plan, maximize the amount of precipitation we have available, so that we can provide that source of electricity to our customers, but also manage the water for fisheries and downstream users. And I guess the last slide I would say is that as we sort of look ahead, we see not only a cleaner but a more resilient energy system, and with the grid really serving as a platform that can help enable new technologies, making it more sophisticated, more automated, more integrated, and more resilient. Something that we're very excited about. And maybe I'll just close by striking a theme that I think Larry noted at the top, which is this is a very complex issue, and it's something that I think fundamentally requires a lot of collaboration, both within companies. There's a lot of folks within PG&E that are working to address this issue, within communities, within regions, and PG&E is pleased to work with many folks in the state on this, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate. And maybe I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Chris. We have just a couple minutes to take some questions, so if you have any questions, please do submit them in the little questions box in your control panel. It doesn't look like we have anything right now, so I just want to wait a little bit to see if any of our participants have any questions for our panelists. All right, and we do have one question. If you could give one piece of advice on how local jurisdiction, can better engage businesses to start the conversation around building resilience, what would that be? Maybe we can start with Chris. I mean, as someone who works in the private sector, what would appeal to businesses?
Thanks so much for the question. It's a really good one. I would say the first step I would take would be to simply reach out and work with folks that you already have relationships with, or develop new ones. And fundamentally, I think it all starts, with a conversation. I know that more and more businesses are increasingly aware of the risks of climate change, but I think maybe to echo some of the points that Katie made, are a little unsure how best to proceed. Is this a short-term risk they face? What's the relevance, to their business? And also, what are some of the resources and information that's available? So I guess, I would just maybe start by reaching out and helping to build the relationship and share, a lot of the work that is underway, and see where you go from there. I guess the only other thing I might add is that, there's a real diversity of businesses, whether it's at the small business or elsewhere, and maybe start with businesses where there may be more of a short-term risk and build some momentum from there. Maybe the last thing I might say is some of the collaboratives and task forces and forums that cities and counties have established are a really helpful vehicle, because that provides a bit of a community of people locally who are working on this issue, and a bit of a process and a structure, something to invite businesses to, for them to learn and be part of, and I think that's been a really effective approach. So hopefully that helps.
And hi, this is Meg. If I could just add, I think Chris's suggestions were really thoughtful and really good. And in addition to the collaboratives, a great channel to reach businesses is through organizations that they're members of, and so which also provides sort of a kind of a one-to-many opportunity for local governments developing relationships with chambers, for example, or other trade associations that then can be distributed by those organizations to their much broader membership base. So that can be, sometimes a fairly scalable way of doing things. And in addition to industries or sectors of the economy that may be at greater risk, I'd also encourage, I think there's opportunities to work, for example, with contractors who are often not necessarily at greater risk, but often sort of a, quote, first responder in the rebuilding effort after something were to happen. And so to the extent that those businesses themselves are already resilient and already engaged with public sector activities, that may, help that accelerate even more.
Great. Thank you, Meg, and thank you, Chris. We do have a couple more questions that I want to get to. What are some examples of initiatives taken by businesses to address climate change-related risks after they have completed an assessment? Katie, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so we've seen a number of different approaches. The ones that I gave examples of for Exelon and Diageo, those were after they had done a vulnerability assessment. So they decided to do a kind of a broad assessment to first identify the key issues. And in the case of Diageo, they identified the key crops that were critical to them and the key regional areas that were vulnerable. And they decided to focus on either improving those crop areas or developing sustainability plans for taking less water out of certain areas. In the case of Exelon, it was actually changing the equipment that was in a facility that was water stressed. So because they used water for cooling of the machinery, they switched to air cooling instead. So we've seen that happen a lot where businesses do an initial assessment to kind of focus in on the particular areas that they're concerned on, and then taking specific approaches. We've also seen businesses raise docks in ports because of sea level rise projections and storm surge, various different kinds of approaches that businesses have taken specifically after doing a vulnerability assessment.
This is Chris. If I could just add, one tool that I think has been helpful for a lot of businesses, and I think someone mentioned at the outset, is the CDP information request, which asks you to, as a company, to really take a kind of a holistic look at the risks and the opportunities associated with climate change. It's something that we've been responding to for, I think, back in 2005. And so I think disclosure and that sort of disclosure can be a really effective tool at helping a company understand the risks. And then it really becomes, I think, an iterative process. You're never really done assessing the vulnerabilities. It just becomes a matter of getting a little bit more granular and then also integrating, I think, what you learn into existing processes, existing strategic planning, but then hopefully just making better decisions, whether it's about your infrastructure or programs. One of the risks that I think Meg mentioned is the risk of electricity, increased electricity demand from rising temperatures. Energy efficiency and demand response can be just great tools to help address that risk, and those are things that are already happening but could be increased in scale and scope and things of that nature.
Great, thank you, Katie and Chris. And I know we're already out of time, but there is just one more question that I wanted to ask all of our panelists. So considering that successful resilience will be a highly interdependent relationship between local government, businesses, and residents, how do you overcome legacy trust issues that have built up between local government, special districts, and businesses and residents?
I guess this is Chris. What I might suggest, maybe just kind of going back to that earlier conversation, just about some forums. I think providing a kind of a structured process, a transparent process for businesses to engage can be a really effective tool to help literally just connect the people who are working on this, to provide a forum for people to share information and learn and find those interconnections. It's the same, basic issue, I think, that a lot of folks are working to address. It may be that folks are looking at it, using sort of a different language or a different process. Some folks may call it resilience, others adaptation. Others may look at it from more of a preparedness standpoint. So I think just providing those opportunities for people to meet others who are working on it helps to build the relationship, find that common ground, and then work towards a common solution.
Yeah, and this is Meg. It would be nice, it would be great if there was sort of a magic wand for some of the legacy issues that the question referred to, but, I think it's just fundamentally comes down to, good, solid, honest, hard relationship building, and an ability to sit together with, different agendas or coming from different perspectives, shall we say, and listen and understand and do it frequently enough that there are sets of relationships that begin to develop rather than something that might feel more transactional in nature and be less lasting.
Great, thanks so much, Meg and Chris. So I think that's going to be the last question that we can take, since we're really over time now. Any of the questions that are remaining, I will send back out to the panelists and have an answer for you guys. And I just want to, once again, thank everyone for participating in this webinar. This is the last webinar of the year for ARCCA. To learn more about ARCCA, please feel free to visit our website, or you can contact me. This webinar was recorded, and the video will be sent out to all of you along with the presentations. Thanks again, and have a great day.